Yi Futian once told Ying Qing that he had a way to leave. She never thought that he meant to fight his way out. Ying Qing probably wouldn't bother to talk to him if she had known this. Yi Futian once told Ying Qing that he had a way to leave. She never thought that he meant to fight his way out. Ying Qing probably wouldn't bother to talk to him if she had known this. How could a man in the Divine Wheel Second Order prevail over the mighty Sunluo manor? Nevertheless, Yi Futian became the god of carnage, now and slaughtered more than of the Renhuangs in Sunluo manor with one strike. He stood high up in the air, his white robe flapping and billowing in the wind. The sword will spread through the field, accompanied by a frightful and strident wail. It soon overcast the sky and blanketed the entire Sunluo manor. Buzz! As the sword will raining down from the sky, the mountains fell, and the palaces collapsed with a series of loud and rumbling sounds. Sunluo manor was razed to the ground there and then. Even though a cultivation method was never absolutely right or wrong, Sunluo manor shouldn't exist in the world for the evil deeds they committed against humanity. If not for Yi Futian's extraordinary abilities and help from Xiaqing Yuan, he would be murdered and transformed into a corpse puppet by Sunluo manor. In addition, he was not the first victim of Sunluo manor. They were apparently accustomed to such crimes. A bolt of terrifying energy suddenly shot out of a palace far away, at the highest point in Sunluo manor. The chief of Sunluo manor, who was cultivating there in seclusion, was disturbed by the noise. An enormous amount of death will surged into the sky and formed the clouds of death, which looked like the face of the Reaper. Buzz! A massive hand of the Reaper that could easily cover an entire mountain was aiming at Yi Futian. Yi Futian looked at it briefly. The clanking sound of the divine sword resonated with the endless sword will. Bathing in the divine light, the sword will brought the cleave of all things into play, and hurtled toward the giant hand of the Reaper. However, each sword turned black and lusterless immediately after coming into contact with the Reaper's hand, and soon evaporated without a trace. A cultivator in the high-level Renhuang plane carried unimaginable strength. The dark hand of the Reaper blotted out the sun, and deprived this field of every glimmer of hope. Xiaqing Yuan activated her divine wheel to wrap the black wind condor, and herself in the light screen of the lotuses to retain their energy and remain unaffected by the attack. Yi Futian pushed his hand forward. The divine sword thrust toward the giant hand of death. The energy of the great path flowed against the stream and almost shattered the space. Bang! With a deafening thump, the mountain under Yi Futian burst into pieces, and his divine sword was hurled back by the shockwave. Both Yi Futian and Xiaqing Yuan were engulfed by the will of death. Nonetheless, the hand of the Reaper also cracked and turned into an endless stream of the death current. Yi Futian's body shook slightly as well. After all, even with his perfect divine wheel, there was a considerable gap between him and a high-level Renhuang in the Divine Will Seventh Order. A burly man, wearing a loose-fit black robe, appeared in the sky above the ancient palace, located at the peak of the highest mountain in Sunluo manor. His jet-black eyes were staring menacingly at Yi Futian from afar. A person in the Divine Will Second Order slaughtered so many cultivators of the Sunluo manor, and even wanted to destroy the whole manor. Chief. Many people mumbled and greeted the man. They were more stunned that Yi Futian, a lower Renhuang, stood firm against the attack from the chief of Sunluo manor. It was an astonishing display of strength. Another burst of domineering death will came from a different direction and turned Sunluo manor into an expanse of death. Under everyone's watch, a corpse puppet flew directly from the Yu Pavilion and stopped in front of Han Lin. It was the dreadful puppet he visited before. Han Lin glared at Yi Futian. Despite Yi Futian's remarkable talent, Han Lin was still determined to kill him here and now. How could a cultivator in the Divine Wheel Second Order beat a high-level Renhuang of Sunluo manor? Han Lin once had a perfect divine wheel, too, and was aware that cultivators with perfect divine wheels had the strength that exceeded their current ranks. It was common for them to be comparable with opponents who were at 2 levels higher. Some outstanding ones could skip 3 orders, but there were 5 steps between the Divine Wheel Second Order and a high-level Renhuang in the Divine Will Seventh Order. It was by no means a small gap. Yet somehow, Yi Futian caused a significant loss to Sunluo manor. Father, he's mine. Han Lin said to the chief of Sunluo Manor in the distance. Yi Futian would become his corpse puppet, and Xiaqing Yuan would meet the same fate in the end. But he wanted to reward her well, and make her pay the price before that. Han Lin formed a seal with both hands. In an instant, the corpse puppet's eyes were lit up with an eerie green glow. The decaying smell of the will of death emanated from its body. With a rustling sound, countless vines of death grew out of the corpse puppet's body, which looked like a rotten ancient tree. Like a million tentacles, the vines blotted out the sky and launched an attack on Yi Futian. The divine sword rushed forward and hacked at the vines. However, the vines kept growing and were approaching Yi Futian at full tilt. The entire field was filled with the stench of death and desperation. The scintillating divine sword carved out an opening and charged at the corpse puppet. With a crackling sound, the divine sword penetrated the corpse puppet and wanted to destroy it with its terrifying sword will. Nevertheless, the corpse puppet stretched out millions of tentacles that twisted and tangled around the divine sword, aiming to dissolve it. The corpse puppet didn't have a life and wasn't afraid of pain. Its tentacles attacked the divine sword frantically, even as the sword will slashed through its body. On the other side, countless vines of death continued to extend toward Yi Futian. On top of that, each vine had a hideous mouth growing on top that was trying to gnaw at Yi Futian. The light screen of lotuses around Xiaqing Yuan was also attacked and slowly eaten away. The vines were already pressing on her. Yi Futian saw it, and his eyes glinted with rage. A beam of even holier light shone from his body, as his superior power spreading out. The area around his body turned into his absolute territory. The invading vines were immediately cleared out. The holy light also shone upon Xiaqing Yuan, and drove off the rotten energy for her. Ashen-faced, the cultivators of Sunluo Manor were staggered by Yi Futian's ability. How could this man become even stronger than before? Besides this kind of power, even Han Lin's expression became grim. The chief of Sunluo Manor stared at Yi Futian and asked gravely, "Who are you?" To his surprise, he sensed a source of imperial power and the will of the emperor from Yi Futian. What was this man's identity? Why would Sunluo Manor offend such a supreme cultivator? People in the divine prefecture were usually very cautious and intentionally avoided becoming enemies with extraordinary cultivators. After all, so many people in the divine prefecture had an unfathomable background. Although Sunluo Manor had a high-level Runhuang in command and was an influential group in the region, they were nowhere near the top forces in the divine prefecture. There were plenty of people Sunluo Manor didn't have the nerve to affront. "I'm a man who was brought to your manor to be transformed into a corpse puppet," Yi Futian responded in a casual tone. The divine sword inside the corpse puppet's body emitted even more dazzling light as he was speaking. "Break!" Yi Futian spat in a cold voice. Countless vines shattered into dust. The corpse puppet burst apart and disappeared in a flash as the incandescent divine sword destroyed everything. The divine sword hovered in the sky and burned with indescribable radiance. The moon cast the divine light over the entire area. One by one, cultivators of Sunluo Manor were frozen into ice sculptures and crackled and fizzed. Some middle-level renhuangs exploded into tiny pieces straight away. Yi Futian darted a glance at the people around Qing. The divine light of the moon fell upon them and took their lives before they could utter a sound. Sunluo Manor deserves to be exterminated. The blade of light illuminated the field and produced the mighty sword will everywhere. More cultivators in the middle-level Renhuang plain were killed by the sword will. A horrified look left on their faces. They would never expect that a cultivator in the Divine Wheel Second Order could destroy Sunluo Manor. Finally, Han Lin started to taste the fear as well. He stared at Yi Futian, his eyes wide open. How could this happen? Yi Futian was only a random dying man Han Lin picked up on the road. Why did he happen to be such a monstrous cultivator with unspeakable strength? Buzz! At this moment, Yi Futian suddenly sensed danger when a faint silhouette appeared in front of him. He knew he was seriously threatened since the faint shadow could attack his spiritual soul directly. Yi Futian felt like his spiritual soul was confined when the chief of Sunluo Manor made a gripping gesture at him from afar. He had trouble controlling his body to react to the attack at this moment. Wisps of energy floated out of Yi Futian's body and turned the field into an absolute great path domain. Yi Futian fixed his eyes on the chief of Sunluo Manor, who immediately sunk into the illusion world created by the eye sorcery. Notwithstanding, he still lunged toward Yi Futian fiercely. "Get the fuck back." Yi Futian focused his eyes on the faint shadow and sent waves of the divine light surging and rolling toward it. The shadow hastily retreated and hid behind the chief of Sunluo Manor, where a massive statue of the Reaper had manifested. The Reaper glanced around. The moon and the sun were appearing in the sky at the same time and shone the terrifying divine light directly on him. He was trapped in the Great Path domain, created by the divine wheel of a lower Renhuang. Yi Futian stretched out his hand, which was holding a spear. Infused with the will of the emperor, the spear spewed out unparalleled energy. Yi Futian became a war god at that moment. The chief of Sunluo Manor seemed alarmed. Innumerable shadows of the Reaper pounced on Yi Futian simultaneously and troubled him with an awful feeling. But Yi Futian was still charged with the ultimate intent of battle. A ray of light penetrated the space as Yi Futian stepped forward. The chief of Sunluo Manor wanted to back off, yet the spear already reached him. The pure energy of Yin froze the air and slowed down his movement. F***ck off. Panic-stricken, he raised his hands and flailed desperately. But the man holding the spear had transfigured into a beam of light and streaked across the sky. With a fizz, the chief of Sunluo Manor exploded. "No!" The scene struck terror into Han Lin, whose face was deathly pale. Yi Futian turned around and looked at him. Yi Futian held the spear and walked toward Han Lin. Han Lin was already in the mid-level Renhuang plane, but all he wanted to do at this moment was running away. However, he was trapped in Yi Futian's Great Path domain. Where could he run off to? Another bolt of lightning struck. Yi Futian vanished from sight and reappeared behind Han Lin. A spasm of pain contorted Han Lin's face until the moment when his body blew up. The few people still alive trembled with fear. Everything seemed like a bad dream to them. A cultivator in the Divine Will Second Order wiped out Sunluo Manor. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Besides Yi Futian, Xiaqing Yuan, and the little condor, Ying Qing was the only one that remained alive in the surrounding area of Xiaqing Yuan's palace in Sunluo Manor. All the other people were killed by Yi Futian, including the rest of the Renhuangs standing behind Han Lin. Besides Yi Futian, Xiaqing Yuan, and the little condor, Ying Qing was the only one that remained alive in the surrounding area of Xiaqing Yuan's palace in Sunluo Manor. All the other people were killed by Yi Futian, including the rest of the Renhuangs standing behind Han Lin. Yi Futian reigned in the will of the emperor, but his body was still radiating brilliantly. The rest of the people in Sunluo Manor looked at Yi Futian with great fear and trepidation. Since the chief of the manor and all of the top cultivators were dead, Sunluo Manor was virtually wiped out by Yi Futian. The cultivators who were still alive were not a threat to Yi Futian at all. The sword will was flowing in the sky and covered the mountains in which Sunluo Manor was located. The entire area was sealed off by the sword will. People who wanted to escape were killed immediately. "Is there any innocent Renhuang in Sunluo Manor?" Yi Futian asked Ying Qing. Her answer would determine the fate of the few Renhuangs who were still alive. Everyone in Sunluo Manor is either an offspring of the Han family or an outsider who decided to join. The offsprings of the Han family are all engaged in refining corpse puppets. Needless to say, the outsiders are accomplices as well. "No one is innocent," Ying Qing replied. Yi Futian nodded. His divine consciousness covered everyone. The sword will burst out of his body and dashed to different directions. One person leaped into the air, attempting to escape. Yet the sword will streaked through space and beheaded him straight away. The same thing happened everywhere else. Following a series of buzzing sound, all the Renhuangs in Sunluo Manor were slaughtered in the twinkle of an eye. The cultivators who were below the Renhuang plain were filled with terror. The silver-haired young man seemed like a monster and the real Reaper in their eyes. Han Lin brought the god of carnage back to Sunluo Manor. "Take my demonic beast with you and deal with the people below the Renhuang plain," Yi Futian said to Ying Qing. Ying Qing understood that Yi Futian had given her the authority to decide if other people could live or die. Ying Qing had been cultivating in Sunluo Manor, but she seemed to be brought here against her will. She was very familiar with people in Sunluo Manor, and knew who should be killed, and who was in a similar situation. In addition, although Ying Qing had been hesitating if she should help Yi Futian, her behaviors in the past led Yi Futian to believe that she was more or less sympathetic toward him. She didn't want him to be brought to Sunluo Manor the first time she met him. Yi Futian supposed that she was a good person by nature. Therefore, she should be the best person to make decisions. Okay. Ying Qing nodded. She didn't turn down Yi Futian's request. It might be sinful to take people's lives, but she was willing to play the bad guy this time. She witnessed many of the crimes in Sunluo Manor, and had been suppressing her anger all these years. This kind of group shouldn't exist in the world. They needed to be destroyed a long time ago. She just didn't expect that everything would happen so suddenly. A dying man who was picked up on the road, and was about to be transformed into a corpse puppet somehow exterminated Sunluo Manor. Ying Qing felt like she was in a dream even now. "Little Condor, follow her and take care of this," said Yi Futian. The black wind condor nodded. He spread its wings and leaned forward with a menacing look. He had been burning with indignation for the past few days. His master was almost turned into a corpse puppet. He would kill off every single person in Sunluo Manor, if this were up to him. But he would follow Yi Futian's instructions. Yi Futian landed on the ground after Ying Qing, and the black wind condor left. He looked at Xia Qingyuan and said, "Thank you very much." Xia Qingyuan nodded slightly. Yi Futian spent days regaining his strength, and didn't even have a chance to talk to her. The crisis was finally resolved, and she was relieved from distress now that Sunluo Manor was destroyed. Emperor Xia doesn't know what happened. He is probably going to stay worried for a while, Yi Futian said with a bitter smile. He owed Emperor Xia a debt of gratitude for his recognition and appreciation of his talents. Emperor Xia adored Xia Qingyuan, and Yi Futian didn't want her to waste her time on him. Therefore, he lied to Xia Qingyuan before to make her return to Emperor Xia's realm. Xia Qingyuan also felt a little sorrowful at the thought of her father. Ever since she arrived at the Divine Prefecture, she had no idea when she could go back, or if she could make it home alive at all. She already learned that she was in the Donghua domain of the Divine Prefecture. Yi Futian turned around and walked to the cliff. He gazed into the distance and said, "I heard that the outer realms are boundless. In the original realm, the 3,000 realms of the Great Path is the land of cultivation. But it seems tiny and trivial when compared with the endless empty space outside. The Divine Prefecture, on the other hand, might be a complete world without those empty space." He couldn't gauge the size of the Divine Prefecture in the short time he had been here. But it was probably impossible for him to return to the original realm in the near future. The divine item Princess Donghuang gave to him could pierce through the Void Realm and bring him out. But it couldn't take him back into the Void Realm from the Divine Prefecture. Thus it was irreversible. Princess Donghuang sent him here, since she didn't want him to die. Yet he couldn't stay in the original realm either. Xia Qingyuan walked to him and said in a low voice, "Emperor Xia's realm was the upper worlds when you were in the 9 states. The 3,000 realms of the Great Path were far away from us." Yi Futian understood Xia Qingyuan. He smiled and said, "Your Highness never said these things to me before." He addressed Xia Qingyuan by her title since they talked about Emperor Xia's realm and the 9 states. "Back in the day, I would just order you to take me with you," said Xia Qingyuan. Taking a trip down memory lane, Yi Futian laughed. He looked at Xia Qingyuan's beautiful face and suddenly felt aroused. He remembered the divine goddess in the lotus that night. "I already said that your Highness must be breathtaking in women's attire. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to see that yet." Yi Futian curled his lips and said. Xia Qingyuan raised her face and saw the smile in Yi Futian's eyes. She turned around and went into the palace to change. She walked out after a short while. The entire world seemed to have lost its color in the face of her beauty. Yi Futian was stunned for a moment, and then he grinned from ear to ear. She was even more gorgeous than he had imagined. Xia Qingyuan walked to Yi Futian. Her eyelashes flickered when she realized that he had been staring at her. Her bright eyes sparkled as she asked him quietly, "Am I beautiful?" "No." Yi Futian chuckled and turned his eyes away. Surprised, Xia Qingyuan rolled her eyes at him flirtatiously. "Liar," she grumbled in a soft voice. Yi Futian didn't deny. Qing and the little condor dealt with the remaining cultivators in Sunluo Manor, and came back to Yi Futian and Xia Qingyuan. "Is it over?" Yi Futian asked Qing. "Yes." Qing nodded. "Good." Yi Futian covered Sunluo Manor with his divine consciousness. "Sunluo Manor doesn't exist from this day forward. You're dismissed." Many people bowed at Yi Futian's direction before they left. They weren't killed because they were not part of the Han family. They were grateful that Yi Futian let them go. He didn't have to go out of his way to sift them out. It was not unusual for a person as powerful as him to kill them all together. But Yi Futian showed them mercy. "Senior, can I follow you to cultivate?" One man was brave enough to ask Yi Futian. Many people turned around upon hearing the question. If they could learn from someone like Yi Futian. Nevertheless, Yi Futian shook his head. The man who asked the question left in disappointment. Other people also gave up that wishful idea. They were already lucky that Yi Futian was willing to let them go. The mountain range soon became quiet after everyone else was gone. Yi Futian looked at Qing and asked, "Did I lie to you?" Qing sighed to herself. She asked Yi Futian, "You don't blame me?" She was not entirely free from worry when Yi Futian was killing Han Lin and others. He might bide his time to clear the score with her after extricating himself from the difficult situation. If Yi Futian was a petty man, it was not impossible for him to eat his words since she didn't help him wholeheartedly anyway. You didn't have a choice at that time. Besides, you risked your own life to help me. Why would I blame you? Yi Futian looked at Qing. Although Qing didn't do a lot, she was a crucial part of his plan. It was critical that she brought him out of the Yu Pavilion to Xia Qingyuan. Otherwise, he couldn't be certain that he would get out safely. On top of that, Yi Futian would be finished if Qing sold him out to Han Lin in exchange for his appreciation. That being the case, Qing basically saved Yi Futian's life. Yi Futian wasn't a narrow-minded, spiteful man. "I told you that we could make a deal once I'm out of danger. There must be plenty of treasures in Sunluo Manor. Do you want to pick some since they're all dead now?" Yi Futian asked Qing. Qing raised her hand and looked at Yi Futian. "Since you acknowledge my contribution, can I give up the treasures and ask you for one thing?" Yi Futian promised her that he would give her something once he got out. "What do you want?" Yi Futian asked. "The treasures in the Sunluo Manor must be in the Renhuang grade." Why didn't Qing want them? He even allowed Qing to pick several rather than just one. "Kill someone for me," Qing said. Her eyes suddenly turned cold and vicious. "Who?" Yi Futian asked. Qing didn't choose the treasures. Instead, she wanted him to kill a person. "The current master of the Dongyuan Pavilion," said Qing. "Who is he?" Yi Futian asked again. Surprised, Qing stared at Yi Futian. A strange look flashed across her face. Yi Futian acted completely normal and looked back at her calmly. Qing realized that Yi Futian really didn't know. How could he not know about Dongyuan Pavilion? Did it mean that Yi Futian was a foreigner who came from another world? Yi Futian noticed Qing's expression and figured out that the person she named was probably very famous. However, he didn't know anything about the Divine Prefecture, except for the few pieces of information gathered through the little condor. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. "Are you from another continent?" Qing asked Yi Futian. "Continent?" Yi Futian looked at Qing in confusion. "Are you from another continent?" Qing asked Yi Futian. "Continent?" Yi Futian looked at Qing in confusion. Qing looked more and more perplexed. Yi Futian had a perfect divine will and extraordinary power. But it seemed that he didn't know anything. Then where did he come from? "I came from a secret zone in the Divine Prefecture that was cut off from the outer world. That's why I don't have much knowledge about the Divine Prefecture," Yi Futian said to Qing. Qing was a little surprised. She didn't know that Yi Futian was referring to the original realm. The original realm was a distant concept to the majority of people in the divine prefecture. Except for the top forces at the highest level, many people didn't even know about the existence of the original realm. Qing obviously wasn't a top-level insider. Even so, she did doubt him since the divine prefecture was boundless and did have many secret zones that were sealed off from the outside. No wonder Futian had such terrifying strength. She was curious about how he was injured and ended up in this area. You do know that the divine prefecture is made up of many plates, right? Qing asked. Futian shook his head and responded, "Isn't the divine prefecture whole? You can say it is whole, but you could also say it's separated." Qing realized that Futian truly had zero knowledge about the divine prefecture once she heard his answer. Countless continents are floating in the divine prefecture. They are located in different places, or may even be at different altitudes. Therefore, it's not technically a single piece of land, but a powerful cultivator can go to any place he wants. Some of the continents are only a few steps away from each other, so it doesn't really matter to cultivators. Futian nodded slightly in understanding. The countless continents Qing mentioned were similar to the 3,000 realms of the Great Path. They were all considered as parts of the divine prefecture. People didn't assign names to each plate, probably because there were too many of them. The difference was that the 3,000 realms of the Great Path were surrounded by empty space, while the divine prefecture was likely to be full. After the Great Emperor unified the divine prefecture years ago, he divided it into 18 domains. Our continent is one of the plates in the Donghua domain. A domain chief's manor was set up in each domain. Although Sunluo Manor is also called a manor, it was a totally different concept. The domain chiefs of the 18 domains in the divine prefecture are lords who help the great emperor govern the boundless divine prefecture. I heard that every domain chief is super frightening. Qing was aware that Futian didn't know anything about the divine prefecture. Thus, she explained to him the partition of the divine prefecture in detail. The domain chief's manors govern the divine prefecture directly? Futian asked. Did they operate like emperors? Qing shook her head. The divine prefecture is vast and contains infinite numbers of continents. How can they govern all of them? The domain chief's manors usually sit out. They only get involved in balancing power when something serious happened. Futian nodded. That sounded a little like the empty imperial palace in the Void Realm. They were inspectors and reported to Donghuang the Great Emperor. After the Great Emperor unified the divine prefecture and set up the domain chief's manors over 3 centuries ago, he ordered people to collect ancient literature on cultivation and summon many cultivators to make copies by hand. Then he asked the domain chief's manors to build a place for cultivation in the largest capital in each continent and share and distribute the copies there. Futian was visibly surprised. How much manpower and time would such an ambitious project require? They picked Dongyuan City in this continent and built the Dongyuan Pavilion to store all the books and literature, said Qing. Back in the 9 states in the Void Realm, Futian already heard that the twin great emperors established academies around the world after they unified the divine prefecture. It turned out that the original realm wasn't the only one. They even distributed the manuscripts all around the divine prefecture. The master of the Dongyuan Pavilion. Futian remembered the man Qing wanted him to kill. Dongyuan Pavilion was the holy land of this continent. No wonder Qing was surprised that Futian never heard of it. Yes. Qing nodded and said, the most powerful groups in the continent managed the Dongyuan Pavilion together after it was established. They also select the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion in concert. Sunluo Manor always wants to join this inner circle and participate in the decision-making process. However, Sunluo Manor was excluded due to their unusual cultivation method, even though they are influential enough. Therefore, the chief of Sunluo Manor has been cultivating in seclusion, hoping that he could achieve some breakthrough and overpower everyone else. By that time, no one could stop him from controlling the Dongyuan Pavilion. Won't these groups become greedy? Futian asked. Of course they will. Qing nodded and continued. The great emperor distributed the copies of the literature around the world with the intention of sharing the knowledge with everyone. But there are too many cultivators in the divine prefecture, and the books can't be available to everybody. Otherwise, the great emperor probably would be kept occupied for this matter alone. Therefore, the top forces and powerful cultivators became the first beneficiaries of the books, since it was easy for them to visit the Dongyuan Pavilion. The groups are obviously greedy and want to share their knowledge with their members, which is allowed. However, since the books are not permitted to be brought out of the Dongyuan Pavilion, no one ever dared to try it anyway. Other groups still want to become co-managers of the Dongyuan Pavilion in order to bring members in and out more conveniently. Futian nodded. The books and manuscripts given to them by the great emperor contained thorough and encyclopedic knowledge. They were the best resources on cultivation methods most of the cultivators could ever get. The top forces in each continent passed the knowledge to their members and then spread it to outsiders through different means. As time went by, all the decent cultivators in the divine prefecture would be able to get some exposure. Of course, the less powerful cultivators only had the chance to get their hands on the second-class books on cultivation methods. Futian admired the intention and effort of Donghuang the Great Emperor and Emperor Yiqing. They genuinely cared about the cultivators around the world, even after they were crowned. Futian wondered what kind of thing made them fall out with each other, and eventually led to Emperor Yiqing's death. How long did it take for the Great Emperor to accomplish such a large-scale project? Futian asked. 100 years, Yiqing answered. Futian was deeply moved. He had been cultivating for less than 100 years in total, yet the Great Emperor spent an entire century on this thing alone. The divine prefecture is too big. Besides taking the time to make copies by hand, people also needed to build places like the Dongyuan Pavilion as depositories and set up matrices for protection. Many cultivators other than the Great Emperor also devoted a lot of time to this. It was said that everyone who worked with the Great Emperor was awarded in the end. Yiqing said, "The Great Emperor did plenty of other things besides this." "Do you admire the Great Emperor a lot?" Futian asked. Apart from the 18 domains established by the Great Emperor himself, there were many other top forces in the divine prefecture. Who else would keep ordinary people in mind at that time of division? Everybody was cultivating solely for themselves, Yiqing said. Most people in the divine prefecture admire the Great Emperor. Futian nodded in agreement. People were selfish by nature. The twin Great Emperors were indeed remarkable and special in that regard. He didn't realize how popular Donghuang the Great Emperor was in the divine prefecture. "So, why do you want to kill the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion?" Futian asked. He finally came to the point. Hearing Futian's question, a look of hatred flared in Yiqing's eyes. "I was a cultivator in Dongyuan City. My master was an eminent man there, and had a close relationship with the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion. They were good friends, and often played chess together. The son of the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion was fond of my master's daughter. Although she didn't like him, because of his arrogance and smugness, they were still friends due to the relationship between their fathers. Who would have thought that the father and son duo were actually worse than beasts? The master of the Dongyuan Pavilion suspected that my master was becoming stronger than him, and was worried that his position as the head of the Dongyuan Pavilion would be threatened. Therefore, he directed his son to work on my master's daughter. The son attempted to rape her, and eventually killed her during the struggle when she was cultivating in the Dongyuan Pavilion. Then, the father invited my master over and killed him in a sneak attack. After that, he ordered people to slaughter all of my master's disciples to keep it a secret. I survived by luck and hid in Sunluo Manor. Sunluo Manor was never on good terms with him, since the chief of Sunluo Manor had been pining for his position as the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion. That's how I got to hide here all these years. Yiqing's voice was filled with loathing. She had been keeping this secret for so long, yet she couldn't take revenge on her enemies. Besides, she vaguely felt that Han Lin of Sunluo Manor might kill her as soon as she proved her path and became a Renhuang. After all, she heard that it happened to other people in the past. Futian remained calm and composed. Endless conflicts and bloodshed concealed beneath the surface of prosperity in the world of cultivators. Does the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion care about his position a lot? Yi Futian asked. Yes, Qing nodded. The man is a hypocrite who is obsessed with the exercise of power. Being the head of the Dongyuan Pavilion symbolizes his status in this continent and gives him control over the access to the Dongyuan Pavilion. Anyone who goes into the Dongyuan Pavilion would be counted as his disciple. Maybe some exceptionally talented cultivators will rise in the future. But my master had no intention of competing with him at all. What's his cultivation level? Yi Futian asked. Since the chief of Sunluo Manor had been hankering for his position, I suppose they are on the same level. He is probably slightly better than the chief of Sunluo Manor, said Qing. It occurred to her that she could ask Yi Futian to avenge on her behalf only after witnessing how he exterminated Sunluo Manor all by himself. Moreover, you should go to Dongyuan City regardless if you want to know more about the Divine Prefecture, Qing added. I promise to do it if everything you said is true, Yi Futian said. But I need to cultivate alone for a while before that. It may take a long time, and I can't say exactly how long. That's all right, Qing nodded. She didn't mind waiting for a couple more years, as long as she could get her revenge. Clean up Sunluo Manor first, Yi Futian said and left. There should be belongings left in Sunluo Manor, since he had killed most of the people. They searched the manor thoroughly, yet didn't find many valuable items. Although Yi Futian only arrived at the Divine Prefecture not so long ago, he had fine taste and didn't care for ordinary things. After that, Yi Futian had been cultivating by himself in Sunluo Manor. He covered Sunluo Manor with the formidable sword will to deter anyone who wished to enter. He would like to advance to a higher level after this narrow escape from death. It was difficult for someone in the Divine Will 2nd Order to kill a high-level Run Huang in the Divine Will 7th Order. He had to rely on the will of the Emperor, which he didn't want to use too often. Therefore, he needed to make some progress before venturing out into the Divine Prefecture. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 1868 Year 10045 in the Divine Prefecture Calendar. Chapter 1868 Year 10045 in the Divine Prefecture Calendar. Year 10045 in the Divine Prefecture Calendar. Yi Futian had cultivated in seclusion for several years. The news about the annihilation of Sunluo Manor had spread out. Many people came to survey the area. However, with the sword will flowing around Sunluo Manor, and the black-winged condor patrolling the mountains, no one had the nerve to barge in. After all, the cultivator who wiped out all of Sunluo Manor couldn't possibly be a friendly and amicable man. Nevertheless, plenty of people living in the greater area were eager to meet the man who destroyed Sunluo Manor and pay their respect. They all knew what Sunluo Manor had been doing, and they were gratified to hear that someone had put an end to it. At this moment, Yi Futian was at the peak of the highest mountain in Sunluo Manor. Wisps of intense energy emanated from his body, and currents of the great path flowed around. His divine will shone brilliantly, and he was radiating with beams of the domineering divine light of the great path. Xiaqing Yuan and the black-winged condor waiting outside both turned their heads around to look at Yi Futian's direction. A ray of the terrifying light of the great path directly shot at the sky. Waves of the great path rolled over Sunluo Manor and neutralized the sword while swirling around in the manor. So powerful. A puff of the great path hit Qing and made her dress flap loudly. Back in the day, even her master and older brothers never gave her such feelings. Although Yi Futian's level was far below her master's, his will of the great path was extremely pure, and the power it carried was just as forceful. Qing couldn't help but exclaim. She wondered which secret zone Yi Futian came from. He had such extraordinary talent. He killed the chief of Sunluo Manor when he was in the Divine Will 2nd Order. His ability was further enhanced now that he advanced to a higher level. Although he might not be able to make away with master cultivators in the 8th Order, he could easily take out a 7th Order cultivator who didn't have a perfect divine will. That being so, Yi Futian was more confident about defeating the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion. Qing didn't care that she had been waiting for several years now. It was not a high price to pay as long as she could exact vengeance. She probably had no chance at all if she had to do it herself. The energy of the great path dissipated after a long time. A silver-haired man stood at the edge of the cliff and gazed into the distance. Qing stared at him and wondered how a young man like him reached such a high level. Moreover, it was surprisingly easy for him to achieve a breakthrough in the Runhuang Plain. Qing saw that both Xia Qingyuan and the Black Wind Condor were walking toward Yi Futian, so she went closer to him as well. Yi Futian looked at Xia Qingyuan and cracked a gentle smile. Beyond his handsome face, his refined manner was also quite appealing. Xia Qingyuan thought his face was even more attractive than when she met him in the 9 states years ago. He seemed maturer and more charismatic now. "Thank you for waiting for so long," said Yi Futian. He finally advanced to a higher level after cultivating for quite some time. But he also knew that he couldn't return to the original realm from the Divine Prefecture after only a few years. He had to be strong enough if he didn't want to be killed the moment he went back. He also needed to have sufficient strength to travel around in the Divine Prefecture. It had been years since he arrived at the Divine Prefecture. He was curious about the situation in the original realm. Since Princess Donghuang issued an order herself, the original realm should be able to remain peaceful for a long time after he died. "Where are we going now?" Xia Qingyuan asked. Qing looked at Yi Futian with expectant eyes. Yi Futian noticed her expression and said to her, "We're going to Dongyuan City." Besides the thing he promised Qing, he also decided to go to Dongyuan City because it was the largest city on this continent and could help him gather more information about the Divine Prefecture. Qing was only in the Saint Plain and never traveled outside this continent herself. Everything she knew about the Divine Prefecture was hearsay. To some extent, she wasn't well informed of the forces in the Divine Prefecture either. The Divine Prefecture was too big for someone in the Saint Plain. Even a Runhuang could hardly visit all of the continents. "Little Condor," Yi Futian called. The Black Wind Condor suddenly spread its wings. As its body growing rapidly, it became a giant pung bird in seconds. Yi Futian, Xia Qingyuan, and Qing rode on the Black Wind Condor. It flapped the wings and dashed into the clouds, where it disappeared right away. Dongyuan City was the largest city in this continent, in which countless powerful cultivators resided. The South Mountain was a famous site in Dongyuan City because of a distinguished man practicing there. Some people named him Priest of South Mountain, and some called him Mr. South Mountain to show respect. He was an old man who had cultivated for many years and took in a great number of disciples. As his disciples grew older and stronger, they became an influential group in Dongyuan City. Back in the days, the South Mountain was acclaimed as the next Dongyuan Pavilion. The Priest of South Mountain and the Master of the Dongyuan Pavilion were also good friends. However, the South Mountain was destroyed overnight. Many years ago, the Priest of South Mountain envied the position of the Master of the Dongyuan Pavilion, so he led his disciples to lay siege to the Dongyuan Pavilion and tried to coerce his friend to let him be the Master of the Dongyuan Pavilion. Nevertheless, his attempt failed, and the cultivators of the South Mountain were cleansed as well. The incident had a major impact and caused quite a stir. At that time, Mr. South Mountain was indeed qualified to compete with the Master of the Dongyuan Pavilion. People could only guess if something else happened behind the scenes. The Master of the Dongyuan Pavilion controlled the Dongyuan Pavilion and had tremendous power. No one was willing to offend him by probing the matter. After all, everybody dreamed of cultivating in the Dongyuan Pavilion, and the Master of the Dongyuan Pavilion was exactly the man who was in charge of granting access. Right now a group of people was standing at the foot of South Mountain. It was Yi Futian and the others. Qing wore a black mask to hide her face. Even though she was not a prominent figure years ago, she didn't want to risk being recognized by people. Returning home, Qing's eyes underneath the mask grew red with tears. She stared at the South Mountain and cast her mind back. She studied in the South Mountain, along with other disciples. Their master was knowledgeable and treated everyone fairly. All the disciples admired him a great deal and were willing to follow him for always. Now the South Mountain was still here, Yet the people were long gone. A bolt of intimidating energy rumbled down the South Mountain and was directed at Yi Futian and the others. Yi Futian raised his face and saw a middle-aged man walking toward them. His cold eyes surveyed Yi Futian and his companions. "Who are you?" the cultivator walking down the South Mountain asked them. "Who are you?" Qing threw the question back. This was her master's place. The man shot a glance at Qing and didn't reply. He kept staring at Yi Futian. It was obvious to him that Yi Futian was the leader of the group. Besides, he could vaguely sense that Yi Futian was strong enough to pose a serious threat to him. "We are old friends of the South Mountain," Yi Futian said. "This is Mr. South Mountain's territory. Why are you here?" "He died a long time ago. This place doesn't belong to anyone. What's your relationship with him?" The man kept asking. "Why did he die?" Yi Futian replied with a question. "I'm the one questioning you." The man sounded cold and domineering. Yi Futian took a brief look at him. Then he turned around and was ready to leave. Even though he made a promise to Qing, he wouldn't go to the Dongyuan Pavilion and kill the master of the pavilion straight away. First of all, he needed to find out if Qing told him the truth. Besides, he couldn't deal with the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion the same way as he did with Sunluo Manor. Sunluo Manor practiced that evil cultivation method, and it was justifiable for him to wipe them off the map. But he could face huge backlash, or even bring trouble to himself, if he killed the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion for no good reason. After all, the master of the Dongyuan Pavilion was helping the great emperor guard the pavilion and disseminate knowledge, at least in theory. "Stay, please," the cultivator said when he realized that Yi Futian was leaving. He used the might of the Great Path to add pressure on Yi Futian. Yi Futian released an invisible form of energy and ignored the man completely. He continued walking away. Bang! With a loud and deadened thump. Many cultivators at the foot of South Mountain felt a great weight on their bodies and were forced to stop moving. Yi Futian was under much more pressure. A shadow of a giant black turtle beast appeared in the sky and pressed down on Yi Futian's body. Yi Futian was still walking. The potent sword will burst out of him and pierced through the giant black turtle beast. The cultivator from the South Mountain uttered a low moan and stepped back. The might of the Great Path was also dispelled. "Don't blame me for being rude if you keep pushing." Yi Futian's voice reverberated in the air. People around were all startled by his assertiveness. The cultivator from the South Mountain was a disciple of the Dongyuan Pavilion. The Dongyuan Pavilion assumed control of the South Mountain ever since they exterminated the South Mountain force. Nowadays, their disciples often came to cultivate here. The man heard that Yi Futian addressed the priest of South Mountain respectfully and called himself an old friend. He wanted to know the true nature of their relationship. However, he wasn't a match for him at all. His opponent was at the Divine Wheel Third Order. His level wasn't lower than Yi Futian's. Soon Yi Futian and the others disappeared. The crowd drew closer to gossip. "This man seems quite powerful. Was he a disciple of the priest of South Mountain?" Someone asked. "I don't know, but they probably knew each other." So many mass cultivators came to Dongyuan City. It looks like something big is about to happen. I heard that Sunluo Manor was destroyed, and everyone in the Runhuang Plain was killed. The killer then stayed in the Sunluo Manor to cultivate. Someone else said, "People in Dongyuan City are saying that that man already left Sunluo Manor and is coming at us. I wonder if he is aiming at the Dongyuan Pavilion. This man is probably a threat to the Dongyuan Pavilion, since he is capable enough to wipe out Sunluo Manor." Yi Futian heard the people's conversation. He planned to pay a visit to the Dongyuan Pavilion. "If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Chapter 1869 Forceful Entry. Chapter 1869 Forceful Entry. The Dongyuan Pavilion was situated in the center of Dongyuan City. This was the holy land of Dongyuan City. Countless people wanted to enter this place to train. Aside from a few special regions, almost all continents of the Divine Prefecture seemed to have locations similar to Dongyuan Pavilion. A few hundred years ago, The great emperor personally sent his people over to establish Dongyuan Pavilion. The cultivation methods within were all copied over from the imperial palace and were extremely precious. They were far more powerful than most of the cultivation methods in the outside world. For many cultivators, entering Dongyuan Pavilion was a milestone on their cultivation journey. Outside of Dongyuan Pavilion, many people were passing in front of it. However, only occasionally would someone be seen entering it. Now, Futian was standing outside of Dongyuan Pavilion. The terrain was very high here. In front of Futian, there was a flight of stairs. Looking up the stairs, one could see a towering structure at a glance. Divine halos of the Great Path circled around the building. Dongyuan Pavilion was the tallest structure in Dongyuan City. Around Dongyuan Pavilion, there were also many grandiose palace complexes. There were also many cultivators there. Dongyuan Pavilion master trained on top of the pavilion and accepted disciples. In reality, they were similar to a powerful sect clan. They also controlled the best resources for cultivating. Hence, who didn't want to become a disciple of Dongyuan Pavilion master and train under him? Under such circumstances, cultivators who could enter Dongyuan Pavilion were among those with the greatest talents. The position of Dongyuan Pavilion master was also extremely high. He stood at the top of Dongyuan City. To the left and right of the stairs, there were two men on guard. When they saw that Futian intended to head up the stairs, they came forward to block his way. Futian frowned. He looked at the guards before him and said, "I have come to take the Dongyuan Pavilion statue assessment. State your name, place of origin and cultivation plane." The person in front of him said, "Yi Lionian, unaffiliated cultivator, Runhuang Plain, third-tier divine wheel." Futian answered. Yi Lionian was naturally his alias. After hearing his reply, the other party nodded their heads. Aside from being granted permission, there was another way to enter Dongyuan Pavilion to train, and that was by taking the Dongyuan Pavilion statue assessment. In every location similar to the Dongyuan Pavilion, the founders back then left behind a statue to assess the talents of cultivators. As long as the person being assessed passed, they were qualified to train in Dongyuan Pavilion. However, this assessment was challenging. Those who could pass it were all monstrous figures. Very few people could manage to do so. The statue assessment was also divided into levels and grades. The guards were just about to let him pass when a voice cried out and said, "Dongyuan Pavilion does not accept your assessment." Futian was stunned. He lifted his head and swept a glance up the stairs at the person who had spoken. He naturally did not recognize the person. Understood. The guards nodded and continued to block Futian's way, not allowing him to advance further. "Why?" Futian asked as he raised his head and looked at the person. His tone was very calm. "Very few people have passed the Dongyuan Pavilion statue assessment. Too many people come every day. Most of them are just a waste of time. Hence, we carry out selections. The two of you have not passed." Futian revealed a strange look on his face. Had not passed. How did the other party carry out their selection? Futian was at the Runhuang Plain, and this was his first time here. He just wanted a chance to be assessed. He had actually not passed. Clearly, the other party was doing this deliberately. The other party was indeed doing this intentionally. They looked at Futian without any concern in their eyes. They even had looks of condescension in their eyes. They needed to agree for Futian to want to enter Dongyuan Pavilion. Futian did not say anything. Before this, someone's will had swept out from Dongyuan Pavilion. Was it for this reason? After all, he had come to Dongyuan Pavilion. For someone to check on him with their will was very common. He did not think much of it. At that moment, his will swept out towards Dongyuan Pavilion. In an instant, the entire region of the vast Dongyuan Pavilion was enveloped within his will. In the training grounds above, there was a group of people who were drinking tea and discussing cultivation. This group of people had extraordinary temperaments. Among them, sitting next to a youth with outstanding temperament, was a silhouette whom Futian had encountered not long ago on South Mountain. Clearly, the other party had rushed over here before he did. At that moment, Futian understood what was going on. The people having their banquet seemed to have noticed that someone's will was observing them. They could not help but raise their eyebrows. The looks in their eyes were somewhat cold. A woman wearing a long dress coldly scolded, "Presumptuous." The moment she uttered this word, she looked in the direction where the will had come from. From a distance she saw Futian, and their eyes met. The wills of the others also swept out and landed on Futian. They noticed that the temperaments of Futian and Xia Qingyuan beside him were rather outstanding. However, for them to have snooped on them with their wills was somewhat presumptuous and rude. "Who handles affairs in Dongyuan Pavilion?" Futian cried out loudly. The cultivator, whom Futian encountered previously on South Mountain, had a cold look on his face. The youth beside him slowly got up and said, "Let's go have a look." The few of them nodded in agreement. They then walked out from Dongyuan Pavilion. In an instant, they were at the top of the stairs. They looked down at Futian standing below. He is the son of Dongyuan Pavilion Master, Lu Dongga. Qing transmitted her thoughts over to Futian. Upon hearing this name, Futian realized that the pavilion master wanted his descendant to rule over the pavilion for generations to come. Hence, even his name was related to the place. The group of people beside Lu Dongga had extraordinary temperaments. Their identities were certainly special. The woman who scolded Futian was dressed like a noblewoman. She bore the proud air of an empress, and she could be considered a beauty. The look she gave Futian was somewhat unwelcoming. She was clearly dissatisfied with Futian's offense. "You wanted to see me?" Lu Dongga asked in a low voice as he looked at Futian. He gazed down at Futian, and his tone was indifferent. He had heard that this person had claimed to know the priest of South Mountain. Futian was also sizing up the other party. What he had heard in Dongyuan City was not the same as what he had heard from Qing. It could even be said to be the complete opposite. Hence, he needed verification. Although Qing had helped him out, he could not kill the Dongyuan Pavilion Master, solely based on what Qing had said. He had promised Qing, if what she said was true, he would kill Dongyuan Pavilion Master. However, from the looks of it, this Lu Dongga was indeed an extremely arrogant person. "I wish to enter the Dongyuan Pavilion to train. I wish to take the assessment of Dongyuan Pavilion," Futian stated calmly. "Denied," Lu Dongga replied as he stood there. "Why?" Futian continued asking. He did not get angry. "A denial is a denial. I do not need to give a reason," Lu Dongga said. In Dongyuan Pavilion, their word was law. Although Dongyuan Pavilion was established by people sent by the great emperor, merely constructing these pavilions on the continents of the divine prefecture took hundreds of years. They did not have the time to manage these places. Hence, these places were controlled by the strongest cultivators and forces of the respective continents. This continent could not be considered a top continent of the divine prefecture. It did not even have a name, and was far from being ranked at all. The great emperor would not bother coming down here at all. Hence, in a sense, Dongyuan Pavilion Master held absolute authority here. Down below, many people were looking over here. They had all noticed the commotion. They all looked at Futian. Someone wanted to enter Dongyuan Pavilion to take the statue assessment, and was being denied entry. Usually, once someone reached the Renhuang Plain, Dongyuan Pavilion would not reject them, and give them a chance to take the assessment. Otherwise, if even Renhuangs were unqualified to take the assessment, how many people would Dongyuan Pavilion Master offend? However, this time, the son of Dongyuan Pavilion Master, Lu Dongga, had personally come out to stop this person. What was so special about this man? Who built Dongyuan Pavilion? Who set the rules here? Futian continued asking. Even more people gathered around upon hearing him say this. Renhuangs were certainly very proud people. Moreover, this person appeared rather young. He would certainly feel dissatisfied when stopped by Lu Dongga. Everyone knew who had built Dongyuan Pavilion. Futian was questioning Lu Dongga by mentioning the great emperor. That being said, what would that do? "Are you done?" Lu Dongga asked. "If you are done talking, please leave. You are not allowed to step into Dongyuan Pavilion." The great emperor built Dongyuan Pavilion, and it is looked after by someone for the great emperor. Currently, Do even the servants around the great emperor take themselves to be the master of the pavilion? Yi Futian said. If you can stand at the top of the stairs, why can't I? Having said that, Yi Futian stepped forward and walked up the stairs. The surrounding crowd revealed strange expressions. Was he planning to enter by force? Lu Donga and the others looked down at Yi Futian. Strange looks flashed past in their eyes. Was he forcing his way into Dongyuan Pavilion? The people beside Lu Donga all revealed bizarre expressions. These people were all cultivators from the top forces of the continent. They happened to be in Dongyuan Pavilion. They never imagined that they would encounter someone trying to force his way into Dongyuan Pavilion. If we say you cannot, then you naturally cannot. The aura of the female Renhuang swept out from her body. It was extremely domineering. There is no point in getting worked up over this, Lu Donga said softly to her. Let's go. As Lu Donga said this, he turned and headed into the Dongyuan Pavilion. He said, those who try to cause trouble and enter the pavilion by force will bear the consequences of their actions. He did not look back, but his voice contained a faint hint of murderous intent. No one doubted what he said. If Yi Futian were truly related to the priest of South Mountain, Lu Donga would have problems finding an excuse to deal with him. Since Yi Futian wanted to force his way in, he could use this opportunity to kill him on the spot. So what if Yi Futian was a Renhuang? How could a mere lower-level Renhuang stand against the forces of the Dongyuan Pavilion? Beneath her mask, a murderous intent flared up in Yingqing's eyes. She glanced at Yi Futian. If this continued, Yi Futian would see what sort of person Lu Donga was. Yi Futian lifted his head and looked up the stairs. Several cultivators stepped forward at the same time. Among them was the Renhuang that he had driven off on South Mountain. He looked at Yi Futian with a cold gaze and said, Dongyuan Pavilion was built by the great emperor long ago. You will not defile this place. If you want to make that mistake, step forward. We will then consider that an attempt at forceful entry into Dongyuan Pavilion. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Chapter 1870 Dominance. Chapter 1870 Dominance. Yi Futian swept an indifferent glance at the other party and said, Dongyuan Pavilion was established by the great emperor. How are you qualified to stand in my way? As he said this, he lifted his feet and stepped onto the stone stairs, continuing to head up. The cultivator revealed a cold expression. Before this, he had been easily driven off by Yi Futian on South Mountain. He was already somewhat dissatisfied about this. Now, in such a situation, Yi Futian had actually dared to force his way into Dongyuan Pavilion. Could it be that he actually believed the forces of Dongyuan Pavilion here today were just for show? A frightening aura of the Great Path swept out. At that moment, his divine will burst forth, and a towering, gigantic black turtle sacred beast appeared in the sky above. A menacing suppressive Great Path descended on the land. It was as though the sky was being suppressed under the feet of this sacred beast. He extended his palm and pressed down on Yi Futian. A gigantic black turtle sacred beast immediately appeared above Yi Futian. In an instant, Yi Futian and the others sensed a huge power over their heads. Divine light emanated from Yi Futian's body. It was as though he was not affected by the power, as he continued to head up the stairs step by step. A huge rumble sounded, and cracks appeared on the stairs beneath his feet. The stairs were made of special material, and were exceptionally sturdy. It contained the power of the Great Path. However, right now cracks appeared on the stairs due to the immense pressure. The cracks propagated outwards, but Yi Futian still stood tall at his spot like a spear. He was unaffected by the cracks. They began fighting. More and more cultivators gathered below. Even those far away could sense the pressure emanating from this place. And they also sent their wills sweeping over. This was Dongyuan Pavilion. Why had a fight erupted over here? Thud. Yi Futian's steps were not hindered at the slightest as he continued up the stairs step by step. The other cultivators walked up to the edge at the top of the stairs and looked down at Yi Futian. Auras from their divine wheels of the Great Path also burst forth from their bodies. A silhouette dressed in white released an aura, that was sharp beyond comparison. In the sky above, terrifying sharp screams could be heard. Many people immediately raised their heads. An astonishing cutting edge coalesced from the great path. It was sharp beyond comparison, and seemed capable of destroying everything. Buzz! An unparalleled spear appeared. It contained a very mighty spear, which could shatter the space. It was vibrating in the sky, yet it did not attack. The crowd below pointed to the sky. Instantly, another wave of shocking current swept across the sky. Another spear appeared. Or it could be said that this second spear was materialized by the unparalleled spear will. Rumble! 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 In the sky, streaks of spear will appeared. Soon, 9 spears were hanging in the sky. The space was suffocating. Attack! His finger pointed downwards and a sharp scream sounded. The long spear shot down and pierced towards Futian, who was being suppressed by the black turtle illusion. Bang! There was a loud bang. Spear will descended from above and crashed onto a dazzling divine light. Golden divine light flowed over Futian's entire body, forming a golden light shroud. The overbearing spear actually could not penetrate the light shroud. People up on top, is that all you've got? Futian sneered. As he spoke, he suddenly stomped the ground. In an instant, the ground shook violently as domineering ripples of the great path propagated. Then, the ripples transformed into a terrifying gale, which swept past the cultivators. The black turtle illusion was shattered into pieces, and the spears were destroyed. The power of the great path, exerted by others to suppress Futian, was lifted too. Moreover, the few Renhuangs who were standing at the top of the stairs were forced to retreat back a few steps, due to the gale that bellowed past them. Their oars were unsteady. Bang! Another loud crash sounded as Futian took a step forward. The cultivators, who were forced to move a few steps backward, felt their hearts trembling violently. Their internal organs churned while their souls quivered. It was as though their souls would be shattered by this step. However, the sound of Futian's footsteps did not stop. He continued advancing step by step up the stairs. Each step he took made their hearts tremble violently. It was not just them. The expressions of the cultivators in the vast space all changed. Even though they weren't facing the power head-on, they still felt their blood and chi churn, as though their bodies were about to shatter from the shockwaves. When Futian took his final step and reached the top of the stairs, an even more terrifying storm of the great path swept out. The Renhuangs who were blocking his way actually let out dull groans and coughed up fresh blood at the same time. Their faces were as pale as paper. They sensed that the power of the great path within their bodies was facing terrifying suppression. At that moment, their expressions changed as they stared at Futian, who had walked up. His divine will of the great path was likely far stronger than their own. When the crowd at the bottom of the stairs saw that Futian had made his way to the top, their hearts could not help but tremble. As expected of a cultivator at the Renhuang Plain, even if the other party denied him access, he still forced his way up. Donghuang the Great established the Dongyuan Pavilion to allow everyone to receive teachings and cultivate. Even those in charge of the Dongyuan Pavilion are just representing the great emperor in managing this place to allow talented people to train in the Dongyuan Pavilion. If all of you can be up here, why can't I? Futian said as he swept a glance at the few Renhuangs before him. The other party was speechless. The people below were also astonished. What Futian said was true. He was clearly stronger than the other party and could suppress them. If these people could be at the top, what qualifications did they have to stop him from also being there? There was no problem with Futian's line of reasoning. However, in the world of cultivation, reason was never proven by words. In front of Futian, Lu Dongga's group that was preparing to leave turned around. When Lu Dongga saw that Futian had forced his way up here, he frowned. His gaze was cold. From the ancient palaces surrounding the Dongyuan Pavilion, silhouettes flew up into the sky and came over. They glanced over at Futian. The previous battle had disturbed the cultivators in Dongyuan Pavilion. Was someone trying to force their way into Dongyuan Pavilion? Futian lifted his head slightly. He glanced over at the various cultivators, but ignored them after. With his current ability, he originally did not need to be worried about the cultivators of Dongyuan Pavilion. Even if he waged war against Dongyuan Pavilion, he did not need to be afraid. If anyone dared to attack him, then he would not hold back. I came to Dongyuan Pavilion to take the statue assessment. When the cultivators of Dongyuan Pavilion stopped me, I took it as a hint that you are stronger than me. However, if you are weaker than me, yet you dare to stop me, it means that you have gone against the will of the great emperor and have desecrated his highness. In that case, don't blame me for not showing mercy, said Yi Futian. He strode towards the towering building. Many people silently nodded in agreement. Yi Futian's logic was not flawed. Since they attacked Yi Futian, naturally, it meant that, in their opinion, Yi Futian was not qualified to enter Dongyuan Pavilion. By right, they should be stronger than Yi Futian. Otherwise, what qualifications did they have to stop Yi Futian from taking the statue assessment? This fellow had actually mentioned the great emperor. However, it was hardly possible for the great emperor to meddle in petty matters like the affairs of Dongyuan Pavilion. There were countless continents in the divine prefecture. This continent was but one of them. It was insignificant compared to the rest. When the Renhuangs, who were defeated by Yi Futian, saw him advancing step by step, they actually didn't dare to stop him anymore. They made way for him. Clearly, they were not confident that they could stop Yi Futian. They had suffered losses at his hands just now. If they continued to stand in his way, they might embarrass themselves. Take him down. Lu Dongge frowned. The few cultivators beside him were all mighty figures. They were gathered here initially to discuss the matters of Dongyuan Pavilion. Under these circumstances, someone had actually forced his way into the Dongyuan Pavilion. One could imagine how Lu Dongge felt now. This would undoubtedly give the other party something to latch onto. The female Renhuang beside him also frowned. Her gaze was cold and indifferent. Her clan and Dongyuan Pavilion master were allied forces. They had a close relationship and shared the same interests. Lu Dongge had barely uttered these words when a terrifying aura was emanated. A middle-level Renhuang with a fourth-tier divine will stepped forward. This scene caused the crowd at the bottom of the stairs to feel disappointed. Dongyuan Pavilion had actually allowed a person with high cultivation to fight. Even if they managed to stop Yi Futian, it would make them look bad. A terrifying will appeared from the fourth-tier divine wheel of this cultivator. He stepped into the air, and a huge scimitar appeared in the sky. It was extremely sharp. The will of the scimitar slashed towards Yi Futian's body. It seemed capable of slashing apart space. Such a dominant technique. Many people could sense an unprecedented and overbearing aura coming from the will of the scimitar. The Renhuang extended his palm. With the scimitar in his hand, the space seemed to become a world of the scimitar. Yi Futian felt himself descend into a world of the will of the scimitar. Before him, the Renhuang was extremely overbearing. He looked at Yi Futian and said, "Step down, and I can spare your life." Yi Futian naturally did not back down. This was also within the opponent's expectations. The will of the scimitar contained murderous intent. You seek your own death. Seeing that Yi Futian was still advancing, he swung down. The scimitar flashed in an instant, faster than lightning. The crowd only saw a light flash before their eyes. Their eyes could not see the scimitar at all. It was too fast. The hearts of many people shuddered. Could Yi Futian survive such a slash? Everyone's gazes turned to Yi Futian. The next moment they narrowed their eyes. Their hearts were beating heavily. Their gazes were fixed in that direction. Yi Futian's arm was raised. Around his body, will circulated. In his palm, powerful currents of the great path flowed. Astonishingly, his fingers were extended and had caught the scimitar. It was not a real scimitar, but one made from the powerful coalesced will of the scimitar. The will of the scimitar was more overbearing and faster than lightning. Not only had it not killed Yi Futian, but it had also even been caught by him. He had caught the will of the scimitar with his bare hand. Even the Renhuang with the fourth-tier divine will felt his heart violently shudder. This was impossible. It was difficult for someone of the same cultivation plane as he was, or even a middle-level Renhuang of a higher plane, to do so. How could Yi Futian possibly pull it off? You wish to spare my life? Yi Futian said as he looked at the cultivator. Divine light was flowing in his hand. The will of the scimitar immediately shattered into dust bit by bit. It was as though the frightening scimitar had no power at all. A high-pitched swooshing sound could be heard. A sword appeared before Yi Futian. The sword will resonated within the vast space. The humming of the sword enveloped the space. Then take a slash from my sword. Yi Futian had barely uttered these words when a divine sword shot across the sky. It similarly stabbed out like lightning. When the other party saw Yi Futian break the will of the scimitar with his bare hands, he was somewhat cautious. He retreated and slashed down at the same time, attempting to avoid the sword strike. The sword and scimitar collided. The sword also contained the power of Een within it. The scimitar was shattered by the divine sword and turned to dust. The sword slashed across the sky and disappeared with a flash. The crowd only saw that when the sword flashed, the cultivator's body in midair trembled violently. His face revealed an intense look of horror. Then, his figure turned into dust and returned to nothingness. If I am not qualified to enter the Dongyuan Pavilion, how many of you can still remain here? Yi Futian said plainly. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Chapter 1871, Manifestation. Chapter 1871. Manifestation. Donghuang the Great established pavilions in the Divine Prefecture to pass on teachings to the people, primarily those with outstanding talent. Now, in Dongyuan Pavilion, the various cultivators were preventing Yi Futian from advancing. However, Yi Futian forced his way in and killed a Runhuang who was at a higher plane. If he was not qualified to enter Dongyuan Pavilion, how many people could stand at the top? Such arrogance. Nevertheless, Yi Futian seemed to have the qualifications to be arrogant. In Dongyuan Pavilion, there was actually no one on the same plane who could stop him. Hence, they needed to acknowledge his strength. The people above were not qualified to stop him. Although that was within reason, the Dongyuan Pavilion was controlled by the forces of Dongyuan Pavilion Master. Yi Futian had forced his way into Dongyuan Pavilion and even killed a Renhuang. This matter would most likely not end well. At the bottom of the stairs, the cultivators who had gathered from all around looked at the white-haired silhouette. This person was so domineering. Could it be that there was a force backing him? Was a top force of the continent attempting to seize control over the Dongyuan Pavilion, and hence sent a warning to the current forces of the Dongyuan Pavilion? Otherwise, even with Yi Futian's outstanding talent, he still only had a third-tier divine wheel. If the forces of Dongyuan Pavilion truly wanted to deal with him, how could he stand against them? As expected, after Yi Futian killed the Runhuang, even more cultivators immediately appeared in Dongyuan Pavilion. In the distance, in front of Dongyuan Pavilion that towered into the sky, silhouettes floated in the air. Their cold gazes swept towards Yi Futian. In the sky above Yi Futian, storms of the great path gathered. In a sinister voice, one of the cultivators said, "To kill someone in front of this holy land, do you have any respect?" Yi Futian glanced over at the other party from a distance. The person was a middle-level Runhuang with a 6th-tier divine wheel. Their eyes met. Yi Futian did not shift his gaze. He similarly glanced at the other party with a cold gaze. He replied, "If I did not catch the scimitar just now, it would be a different story, wouldn't it? For forcing my way into Dongyuan Pavilion, I must be killed, is it?" As Yi Futian said this, he continued to advance step by step towards Dongyuan Pavilion. He was looking at the statue in Dongyuan Pavilion. The great emperor wanted to pass on teachings to the world, so he established Dongyuan Pavilion. The person who built the pavilion left behind this statue. The will of that senior must reside within it. If he saw the pavilion that he built be reduced to being used by others for personal gain, and be claimed as their own training ground, I wonder how he would feel. Yi Futian declared, "All of you are defiling this holy land." His voice reverberated throughout the space. It was as though it was a sound of the great path. Across a space of hundreds and thousands of miles, countless people stopped in their tracks. They could all hear this sound of the great path. The forces of Dongyuan Pavilion Master were defiling the holy land? Today, Lu Donga blocked Yi Futian, and denied him entry into the Dongyuan Pavilion. He probably never imagined that Yi Futian would be so domineering, and that he would actually kill a Ren Huang here. Such a commotion would surely be detrimental to the current forces of the Dongyuan Pavilion. Even more people would question them. Many people were supporting Yi Futian in spirit. These past few years, Dongyuan Pavilion had indeed been completely under the control of the forces of Dongyuan Pavilion Master. Whoever they allowed could enter the Dongyuan Pavilion. Whoever they denied entry would not be able to. Many people accepted this hidden rule, and hence all of them strived to pass the assessment of Dongyuan Pavilion Master to enter the Dongyuan Pavilion. However, that way many genius figures could only enter the pavilion by joining them. Every time there was a large-scale assessment to enter Dongyuan Pavilion to train, one had first to become one of them. This situation made many people bear grudges secretly. However, Dongyuan Pavilion Master was one of the top figures of this continent. Aside from a few forces at the same level, who could question them? At that moment, a few silhouettes walked out from the Dongyuan Pavilion. The person in the middle had sharp eyebrows and sparkling eyes. His gaze was like a sharp sword, and gave off an extremely powerful sense of authority. When the cultivators saw him appear, they frantically made way for him. They bowed slightly and greeted, "Pavilion Master." The silhouette who appeared was actually Dongyuan Pavilion Master. The few people beside him all had similarly extraordinary temperaments. Although they did not release their auras, a faint pressure could be felt coming from their bodies. Among them was a person who had a faint smile on his face. He looked at Yi Futian from afar, and said with a smile, "What this junior has said is not without reason. His ability is also not weak, being able to kill a Ren Huang of a higher cultivation plane. Although he appears somewhat presumptuous, it is also with reason. Does young Pavilion Master have a grudge with him?" After he spoke up, many people were somewhat surprised. This person who had emerged from inside the Dongyuan Pavilion was actually speaking up for Yi Futian. This would undoubtedly offend Dongyuan Pavilion Master. Obviously, this person was not concerned about that at all. Someone recognized who he was, and immediately said in a low voice, "He is Emperor Helion, the lord of the royal family of the western territories of the continent." These past few days, there have been rumors that a few top forces had arrived in Dongyuan City. From the looks of it, the rumors were true, said some people in the crowd. They then looked at the other people. The people who stood next to Dongyuan Pavilion Master were the strongest figures of the continent. Many people looked at Lu Donga when they heard what Emperor Helion said. Prior to this, Lu Donga was extremely domineering when he denied Yi Futian entry to the Dongyuan Pavilion. Many people did not understand why he did so. Could it be that he actually bore a grudge against Yi Futian? Even though his talent is outstanding, he is so unruly. A middle-aged figure with extraordinary temperament said, "Even if he achieves anything with his cultivation, he will be a menace. How can we let him train in the Dongyuan Pavilion? I do not believe that Donga has done anything inappropriate." This speaker was the lord of a top clan. He was also the father of the woman beside Lu Donga. He was close with Dongyuan Pavilion Master. These past few years, their relationship had grown even close. They were considered allied forces. So he naturally continued to support Dongyuan Pavilion Master. As long as he was in his current position, he just needed to ask to send his clan members to train in the Dongyuan Pavilion. In terms of rules, for a Ren Huang to come over actively to take the assessment, would he not even be qualified to enter? Another person said. Is this a rule set by Pavilion Master Lu? While Dongyuan Pavilion Master was listening to these people's words, his expression was icy. He looked at Yi Futian before him and said, "Step aside. Let him take the statue assessment." The crowd was stunned. They all revealed bizarre looks. What was the intention of the Pavilion Master? The people beside Pavilion Master smiled as they looked at him. Dongyuan Pavilion Master continued saying, "If this person cannot cause the will of the statue to manifest, kill him then." Understood. The cultivators of the Dongyuan Pavilion responded. There was faint murderous intent in their gazes. No one understood the statue more than them. Ordinary cultivators could not even communicate with the will within the statue. Those with exceptional talent could make the will of the statue circulate within it. As long as they could detect the existence of the will and activate it, they would be allowed to train in the Dongyuan Pavilion. However, wanting to make the will of the statue manifest was extremely difficult. Few people had managed to do so. Yi Futian was arrogant to the extreme. He had forced his way into the Dongyuan Pavilion and raved about wanting to take the assessment. Since Yi Futian wanted to do so, Dongyuan Pavilion Master would give him a chance. If Yi Futian could not cause the will of the statue to manifest, he would be killed. Yi Futian glanced over at Dongyuan Pavilion Master. Kill him? Who in the Dongyuan Pavilion could kill him? Of course, he did not argue with the other party. Since they allowed him to take the assessment, then he would give it a try. Yi Futian walked forward and came before the statue. The master of this statue appeared to be around 40 to 50 years old. His pupils sparkled and contained a frightening look in them. The statue was 100 zhang tall and stood erect in front of the Dongyuan Pavilion like a guardian deity. One could sense a formless pressure just standing before it. Yi Futian's body floated up into the air. He looked towards the statue as it stood there. Although he could feel a formless pressure from it, there was no aura emanating from it. The statue seemed to contain heavenly might within it that it did not let out. Ordinary people could only sense that it was miraculous, but would be unable to truly pry further. Yi Futian's eyes changed and became exceptionally deep. They even appeared somewhat sinister. It was as though everything in the world appeared clear to him. When he glanced over at the statue, it seemed to come alive, as though the entire statue was formed from countless runes of the Great Path. It was even connected with the towering Dongyuan Pavilion. Buzz! The crowd saw the statue suddenly radiate light. Many people narrowed their eyes as the statue lit up. So fast. He had actually caused the statue to light up in an instant. As expected, he is truly exceptional. The elder who previously spoke up for Yi Futian praised him with a smile. Emperor Helian seemed very interested in Yi Futian. This Renhuang still appeared to be a young man. He might have cultivated for less than 100 years. However, his talent and combat ability seemed to be top-notch. Murderous intent brew in Dongyuan Pavilion Master. If the other party actually managed to activate the will of the statue, what would Dongyuan Pavilion Master do? The statue shone brighter and brighter. Its 100 zhang tall figure sparkled with divine light. The aura of the Great Path flowed over the statue. This caused the look in the eyes of Lu Donga and the others to shift. Although they could also activate the will of the statue, Yi Futian was doing it much faster than they could. Buzz! On the statue, brilliant colorful lights suddenly radiated, blinding all around it. The people below the pavilion cried out in astonishment. They felt that the light was somewhat blinding. Aura of the Great Path emanated from it. The will of the statue manifested. The gaze of many people froze. This was too fast. How could Yi Futian possibly do it so fast? The cultivators of Dongyuan Pavilion were all shocked. Even Pavilion Master was momentarily stunned. Is that all? Yi Futian said indifferently, as he glanced over at Dongyuan Pavilion Master. Yi Futian seemed very at ease. He had effortlessly completed what Lu Donga had spent a long time trying to achieve back then. The Dongyuan Pavilion has not lit up. You cannot consider that as the will of the statue manifesting. Dongyuan Pavilion Master said in a cold tone. He remained calm. He clearly did not want to let Yi Futian go. Is that so? Yi Futian smiled. The instant he finished speaking, rainbow light flowed over the Dongyuan Pavilion. It flowed all the way up until it pierced the clouds. The Dongyuan Pavilion that pierced the sky immediately lit up with dazzling lights, causing even the clouds in the sky above to light up. Dongyuan Pavilion Master's gaze froze. He was actually speechless. How did Yi Futian manage to pull this off? The people below the Dongyuan Pavilion were also in awe when they witnessed this scene. Voices sounded one by one. This was practically. Rumor has it that the rule back when Dongyuan Pavilion was established was that if someone could cause the entire Dongyuan Pavilion to light up, Dongyuan Pavilion would be completely open to him. The person would be able to access all 81 floors of Dongyuan Pavilion. No one could prevent him from doing so. Dongyuan Pavilion Master intended to make things difficult for Yi Futian. Yet his scheme had been easily circumvented. How is Pavilion Master feeling right now? Is that enough? Yi Futian continued. If that is not enough, how about this? After Yi Futian said these words, resplendent colorful lights shot out from the Dongyuan Pavilion. Endless divine halos of the Great Path burst forth from the statue. An illusory figure appeared. It seemed to be a manifestation of the statue. The will of the statue had descended. It floated in the sky above. Colorful light swept out over 3,000 miles. Within Dongyuan City, countless people raised their heads and looked towards the light of the Great Path. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. 1872 Person in charge? 1872 Person in charge? In front of the 81-story Dongyuan Pavilion, the will of the statue manifested, and the brilliant light of the Great Path shone for 3,000 miles. Over there, an illusory silhouette appeared. It seemed alive, as though it was actually existing. At that moment, the eyes of the illusory silhouette suddenly opened. In that instant, the hearts of countless people around the Dongyuan Pavilion trembled. Their hearts wavered. Had he awakened a hidden will within the statue? A divine halo enveloped the statue. The illusory silhouette looked at Yi Futian. At that moment, Yi Futian's eyes seemed to traverse the endless space. He saw the silhouette of a mighty figure in another world. It had not been difficult for him to activate the will of the statue. The person who forged this statue back in the day had left behind a will of the Great Path to test the people. Yi Futian had also immediately activated the will of the statue, awakening the master of the statue. Hence, an astonishing scene appeared before his eyes. 3,000 miles of space was enveloped in resplendent light. Everyone in Dongyuan City raised their heads and looked at the divine silhouette in their sights. It is the statue in front of the Dongyuan Pavilion. What is going on? The people in the city burst into an exciting discussion. For the statue to have manifested, something big must have happened. Countless people frenziedly rushed over in the direction of the Dongyuan Pavilion. It was not just the people of Dongyuan City. Right now, even the major figures around the Dongyuan Pavilion were trembling in awe. This included the top figures of the continent, such as Emperor Helion. This fellow had actually achieved something that they had never been able to pull off. It was laughable that the cultivators of Dongyuan Pavilion had actually prevented Yi Futian from entering. Even Dongyuan Pavilion Master had intentionally made things hard for Yi Futian and had wanted him to activate the will of the statue. Yet they most likely never imagined that Yi Futian would reach this step. This time, Dongyuan Pavilion Master had slapped himself in the face. When Dongyuan Pavilion Master saw this scene, the look in his eyes was complicated. Although he was filled with awe, he similarly had cold, murderous intentions. He felt threatened. As Pavilion Master, someone had achieved something that he had never been able to do. The will of the statue had manifested before the crowd. How was he feeling right now? If this person had caught his eye, matters would still be all right. However, they just so happened to have prevented the other party from entering the Dongyuan Pavilion. This was an extreme mockery for them. Right now, Dongyuan Pavilion Master was angry inside as he secretly blamed Lu Donga. Why hadn't this useless fellow not allowed Yi Futian into the Dongyuan Pavilion? Pavilion Master did not know about this matter. However, now that the situation was already like this, he could not change it anymore. Welcome, Senior. At that moment, a few major figures beside Dongyuan Pavilion Master bowed slightly at the silhouette that had manifested. They would naturally show respect to the founder of Dongyuan Pavilion. The silhouette that had manifested did not look at them. Instead, he looked at Yi Futian and said, "There will be no restrictions for you in Dongyuan Pavilion. You can even become the person in charge of Dongyuan Pavilion." "Many thanks, Senior," Yi Futian replied as he bowed in respect. Immediately, the resplendent light dissipated. The illusory silhouette also gradually disappeared. The light of the great path surged into the statue. When everything returned to normal, it was as though nothing had happened. Internally, the hearts of the crowd could not calm down. They were astonished. The members of Dongyuan Pavilion had forbidden Yi Futian from entering. However, now that the founder of Dongyuan Pavilion had personally manifested and appeared, there were no longer any restrictions on him in Dongyuan Pavilion. What was even more astonishing was the sentence that came last. Yi Futian could become the person in charge of Dongyuan Pavilion. What did this mean? The founder had handpicked Yi Futian to control Dongyuan Pavilion. When Dongyuan Pavilion Master, who was initially bowing, heard this, he raised his head. His heart was as cold as ice. A murderous intent flashed past in his eyes as he looked at Yi Futian. Yi Futian could take charge of the Dongyuan Pavilion? Then who was Pavilion Master? This time Pavilion Master, as well as his subordinates, had made fools of themselves. Their image was ruined. The cultivators below the Dongyuan Pavilion thought to themselves. This was truly a slap to the face. After the statue returned to its original state, the Dongyuan Pavilion actually became exceptionally quiet. No one said anything, and the atmosphere was somewhat bizarre. It was as though no one knew where to begin. Lu Dong's expression was as ugly as it could be. He was the instigator of all this. Before this, he had denied Yi Futian from entering the Dongyuan Pavilion. When Yi Futian inquired about his reason for doing so, Lu Dongge had said that Yi Futian was not allowed to do so because he had not allowed it. He had no reason, and he could decide everything. What about now? Was he going to cast Yi Futian out of the Dongyuan Pavilion? Today, the various cultivators had witnessed everything that had occurred. Very soon, this matter would be known throughout Dongyuan City. Lu Dongge couldn't kill Yi Futian and pretend nothing happened. Would their forces still be qualified to be in control of the Dongyuan Pavilion then? Most likely, no one would accept the outcome if they tried to do so. Spectacular! Emperor Helian cried out in astonishment. He looked at Yi Futian and said, "This statue has stood here for 300 years, and no one has ever managed to manifest the will of the statue like you have done, little friend. You awakened the founder of Dongyuan Pavilion. Today has truly been eye-opening. It is laughable that the cultivators of the pavilion actually tried to stop you. I wonder what their intentions were." "Pavilion Master Lu, are you still going to stop him?" Emperor Helian asked Pavilion Master. He wanted to make the other party look bad in front of the crowd. Clearly, they were not close. It could even be said that there was bad blood between them. If not, Emperor Helian would not put Dongyuan Pavilion Master on the spot like this. Since Yi Futian has managed to do so, and the founder of Dongyuan Pavilion has personally spoken, we will let bygones be bygones, Pavilion Master Lu said as he looked at Yi Futian. From today onwards, you can enter the pavilion as you please. You have absolute freedom. Under such circumstances, what could he do? Would he defy the wish of the founder? He could only let things be and acknowledge Yi Futian. Yi Futian would be able to enter the pavilion freely. As for the death of the Ren Huang, Pavilion Master Lu could only keep quiet and not mention it. The Ren Huang was fated to have died in vain. Yi Futian swept an indifferent glance at the other party. This was beyond what he had expected. Before this, if the Pavilion Master continued to act outrageously, Yi Futian would have immediately retaliated. With Yi Futian's current cultivation, even if he did not activate the will of the Emperor, he should be able to put up a fight. Of course, he was not sure about Pavilion Master Lu's actual combat prowess. Nevertheless, Yi Futian's opponent couldn't take his life. If Yi Futian came again after breaking through to the next plane, that would cover all his bases. He would not release the will of the Emperor in public. It was his trump card. Is that all? Emperor Helian said as he narrowed his eyes at Pavilion Master Lu. With a smile he continued saying, "Did Pavilion Master not listen clearly to what the founding senior said before?" The master of the statue had manifested and proclaimed that Yi Futian would be in charge of the Dongyuan Pavilion in his place. This meant that Yi Futian could become the new pavilion master. Helian, even though the founding senior said so, his cultivation is currently only that of a lower-level Ren Huang. How will he have authority over the powerful ones, and control the Dongyuan Pavilion. The middle-aged man beside Pavilion Master Lu said before Pavilion Master managed to respond. My Hellion royal family is willing to aid him, Emperor Hellion said with a smile. Such wild ambition, the middle-aged man coldly snorted. Do you want to look after the pavilion? Pavilion Master Lu asked Yi Futian, causing the two of them who were bickering to shut up. They both gave Pavilion Master Lu strange glances. Could it be that he had changed his attitude towards Yi Futian? Yi Futian looked at the other party and revealed an expression of amusement. He asked, What if I want to? Since the founding senior has spoken, if you want, I will hand over the position of Dongyuan Pavilion Master to you, Pavilion Master Lu explained. However, since your current cultivation plane is not high enough, we will temporarily aid you in maintaining order in the Dongyuan Pavilion. When you no longer need us, I can hand over the responsibilities completely to you. Yi Futian smiled as he looked at the other party. This was a good suggestion. That way, both he and the other party could manage Dongyuan Pavilion together. As a puppet, no one would even know how Yi Futian died. With so much time, wouldn't it be easy to kill a lower-level Renhuang? The other party might be thinking so. Many thanks, but that will not be necessary, Yi Futian said. He then walked towards the Dongyuan Pavilion. When he saw Lu Dongga standing to the side, he said, You denied me entry to the Dongyuan Pavilion, yet I still made it up here. Lu Dongga's expression froze on his face. He had no words to respond to Yi Futian. He could only watch as Yi Futian continued walking forwards. Xiaqing Yuan, Ying Qing, as well as Black Wind Condor, followed Yi Futian. Black Wind Condor swept a sharp glance at Lu Dongga and said, Idiot. A will emanated from Lu Dongga. The look that Black Wind Condor gave him was somewhat provocative. Brood may not enter, Lu Dongga said. Dongga. Pavilion Master Lu interrupted him. Lu Dongga endured it as he watched Black Wind Condor walk into the Dongyuan Pavilion. Interesting, Emperor Hellion exclaimed with a smile. He then placed his hands behind his back and casually waltzed into the Dongyuan Pavilion. This scene caused the expression of Pavilion Master Lu to turn ugly. This old fellow was originally plotting to take his place. Now, was he planning to use Yi Futian to seize control over the Dongyuan Pavilion? Yi Futian stepped into the Dongyuan Pavilion and was astonished by the building. An aura of the Great Path enveloped the entire Dongyuan Pavilion. The interior was all-inclusive. The ancient manuscripts of the Great Path that were carved on the walls could not be taken away from this place. They were carved onto jade scrolls using specialized methods. One could only inspect them using their will. At the center of the Dongyuan Pavilion was a spiraling staircase that extended upwards until the 81st floor. Yi Futian glanced around. The lowest floor did not contain anything that he needed. They were all cultivation methods for people of low cultivation planes. He then made his way up the stairs. Although Yi Futian did not lack cultivation methods, since this place contained the teachings that Donghuang the Great had ordered people to copy down for the masses back then, they must be suitable for all cultivators. There might be some incredible cultivation techniques among them. Ying Qing quietly followed behind Yi Futian. Everything that occurred today had a huge impact on her. How monstrous was this cultivator, who was picked up by Han Lin from Sunluo Manor? Now she was not worried at all about her revenge. Since Yi Futian had promised her, he would certainly help her settle it. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Chapter 1873. Agreeing to replace. Chapter 1873. Agreeing to replace in Dongyuan Pavilion. Yi Futian was quietly reading ancient manuscripts about techniques, without thinking about things that were happening outside. What he did in Dongyuan City had stirred up a huge commotion. Countless people were discussing him now. However, Yi Futian acted as though nothing had happened, and had temporarily cast everything out of his mind. Even though he had agreed to Ying Qing's request, this was but a part of his experience while training in the Divine Prefecture. He would not waste too much of his energy on it. He He had always remembered his purpose here in the divine prefecture. No matter where he was, he only had a goal: to train and get stronger. He had already cut off his connection with the original realm, so he couldn't know what was happening over there. Even if he knew, he couldn't do anything about it. He could only improve his ability as much as possible within a short period of time, so that he would be a match for those peak figures. Only when he achieved his goal could he have a chance to return to the original realm and fight against forces like Shin Clan and Golden Divine Nation. In the blink of an eye, Yi Futian had stayed in the Dongyuan Pavilion for a few days. Throughout his stay, several Dongyuan Pavilion cultivators had visited the place. The gazes they gave him were hostile, but no one dared to attack Yi Futian while they were in the Dongyuan Pavilion. Without distractions, Yi Futian was completely drawn in by the collection in the Dongyuan Pavilion. This was a huge library of teachings of Wei. It could be considered a treasure trove. The teachings that Dong Huang the Great passed on to the world were astonishingly powerful. They were even more valuable than he had imagined. Any cultivator would be able to find what they needed here. Yi Futian couldn't help but respect Dong Huang the Great and Emperor Yi Qing. He naturally did not need to mention Emperor Yi Qing. As for Dong Huang the Great, setting aside how this legendary figure actually was, he was indeed an epical figure. He had also contributed greatly to the divine prefecture. Such a spirit was worthy of admiration. Yi Futian also understood why the various forces wanted to control the Dongyuan Pavilion. For some jade scrolls, practicing them here by inspecting them with one's will was more effective than memorizing them to practice later. At that moment, Yi Futian was sitting in one corner and practicing quietly. His will entered into a jade scroll, silently experiencing everything within it. A divine halo of the great path flowed over his body, causing many people to look over in his direction. After a long while, Yi Futian's will withdrew from the scroll, and he continued to study other ancient manuscripts. He became more and more engrossed in his inspection of the manuscripts. This made Ying Qing feel as though he had forgotten why he had come to the Dongyuan Pavilion. She was also getting more and more curious about Yi Futian's identity and origins. At that moment, Ying Qing seemed to sense something. She turned around and looked beside her. She saw a woman dressed in a plain white dress standing there quietly. This woman appeared to be around 30 years of age and was very beautiful. She lacked the aura of a young maiden and instead bore a more mature air. Her figure could also be considered flawless and caused people to be lost in wild and fanciful thought. The woman's temperament was also extremely outstanding, giving off an otherworldly sense of beauty. She bore the elegant air of royalty and appeared slightly distant and proud. It was as though she was a fairy goddess who was from beyond this world. Ying Qing could sense that this woman had strong cultivation. She was definitely a Run Huang, and not a lower-level one at that. She kept standing quietly as she watched Yi Futian cultivating. Yi Futian also seemed to have noticed her as he sat there. He stood up, turned around, and glanced over at the other party. He politely asked with a smile, "Is Goddess looking for me?" Clearly, he had noticed that the other party had been watching him all this while. Even though the cultivation methods here are powerful, they are difficult to cultivate and require a long time to comprehend. If you are only staying in the Dongyuan Pavilion for a short while, you will most likely find it hard to comprehend anything meaningful, the woman said. What about this dictionary of the Wei? Yi Futian pointed toward a corner. It is also one of them. The other party nodded. I shall take that into consideration, Yi Futian replied with a smile. If Goddess has other matters, please feel free to speak. My father has waited for Ren Huangyi for a few days. However, Ren Huangyi has yet to emerge. Hence, he has asked me to take a look and invite Ren Huangyi to grace him with a meeting, the woman stated. I am a member of Emperor Helian's royal family, Helian Yu. She is the eldest princess of the Helian royal family. Ying Qing transmitted her thoughts over to Yi Futian. Emperor Helian's royal family is one of the continent's royal families. They have powerful abilities no weaker than that of Sunluo Manor. They have many more cultivators under their control than Sunluo Manor. Before this, the person who spoke up on your behalf outside was Emperor Helian. Yi Futian had a pretty good grasp of the situation as he nodded his head and said, All right. However, please give me some more time. There are some parts that I have yet to comprehend. All right. Helian Yu responded as she nodded her head. Yi Futian then continued cultivating. With nothing else to do, Helian Yu also studied some cultivation methods to the side, comprehending them and cultivating herself. In the blink of an eye, a few days passed. Helian Yu had kept very quiet all this while, never rushing Yi Futian. A will flowed over Yi Futian's body. However, it was under his control. He stopped cultivating. Yi Futian looked at Helian Yu. He smiled and said, "If I kept cultivating, would you have kept waiting for me?" He could tell that this eldest princess of Emperor Helian had a higher cultivation than him. She had actually waited for him all this while. On this point, she had far surpassed Lu Dongga. It was just a few days. By simply comprehending cultivation methods, time passed by in a flash. "Are you still going to remain cultivating in the Dongyuan Pavilion?" Helian Yu asked. She did not mind. When she spoke, her tone was very indifferent, giving off a very comforting vibe. "Let's go," Yi Futian answered as he smiled. Such a beautiful eldest princess was so calm and peaceful. It was pleasing to the eyes. They headed down, and then left the Dongyuan Pavilion. Behind them, several silhouettes appeared outside of the pavilion, watching them as they left. Lu Dongga had also appeared, together with the woman beside him. Their gazes were cold. "Helian Yu," Lu Dongga mumbled to himself. "That old fox. He most likely wants to use this person to seize control over the pavilion." Yi Futian naturally did not know what they were thinking. He also did not care. Helian Yu brought Yi Futian to a tavern. At the top floor of the tavern, a banquet had been laid out. Aside from Emperor Helian, there was another cultivator that he had seen in the Dongyuan Pavilion that day. The cultivator was also with the pavilion master of Dongyuan Pavilion back then. "Little friend, please sit," Emperor Helian said to Yi Futian with a smile. Yi Futian sat down in a seat. The middle-aged man across from him also nodded his head at Yi Futian. This middle-aged man had a sharp aura on him. His cultivation should be on par with that of pavilion master. "I believe little friend knows who I am. This is my good friend, Yang Dongqing, the city lord of Tianmu City," Emperor Helian introduced. Tianmu City is one of the 3 major cities of the continent. It is only second to Dongyuan City. Yang clan controls Tianmu City, and the clan leader, Yang Dongqing, is the city lord of Tianmu City. Qing transmitted her thoughts as she introduced Yang Dongqing further. If Yi Futian were a cultivator of the continent, he would naturally understand this. However, Qing understood that Yi Futian was clueless about all this. "Senior Yang," Yi Futian greeted Yang Dongqing as he dipped his head slightly, not bowing. In the cultivation world, if they were strangers, they would usually determine hierarchy based on ability. From this point of view, Yi Futian was no slouch. However, the other party was a senior figure. Hence, Yi Futian still greeted him as one. "Little friend, that day, you made the members of Dongyuan City witness history in the making. It was also an eye-opener for me," Yang Dongqing said as he nodded with a smile. For both of them to treat a junior in such a manner, they clearly wanted to get on Yi Futian's good graces. Yi Futian did not respond. Instead, he looked at Emperor Helian and asked, "Senior, what business did you have with me?" "Since little friend has asked, I will be frank," Emperor Helian replied. "The pavilion master of Dongyuan Pavilion has controlled the pavilion for many years. All these years, Lu Han's control has grown stronger and stronger, to the point that he views the Dongyuan Pavilion as his own property. Even if our members wanted to enter the Dongyuan Pavilion to train, it would be difficult, requiring his approval. Hence, we have planned to replace him with a new pavilion master." "Little friend, you received the approval of the founder of the Dongyuan Pavilion that day. It is only right for little friend to be in charge of the pavilion and replace Lu Han," Emperor Helian continued. "These past few days, little friend has also entered the Dongyuan Pavilion and have seen what is inside. I believe that you are now familiar with it. Although this time Pavilion Master Lu admitted defeat, he must certainly hate you now. After all, for him, you have already become a threat." Yi Futian nodded. He naturally understood this. However, he was not concerned about it. From the looks of it, Emperor Helian and Yang Dongqing wanted him to replace Lu Han as pavilion master. What Helian says is true. Lu Han will certainly kill you, Yang Dongqing also stated. Yi Futian lowered his head and asked softly, Seniors wish to support me in becoming the next pavilion master of Dongyuan Pavilion. Then what will happen after that? Will I need to hand the pavilion over to seniors to manage it? I also have a huge clan and business to manage. I am not free to stay in Dongyuan City all the time, Emperor Helian responded. I will be content as long as I don't have to put up with the long faces of others whenever I enter Dongyuan Pavilion. After little friend has become pavilion master, my Helian royal family will go all out to support you. My only request is for my clan members to have access to the Dongyuan Pavilion at all times. Does Pavilion Master Lu stop seniors men from entering the pavilion to train now? Asked Yi Futian. Most of the time he doesn't, Emperor Helian replied in a cold tone. However, once in a while, he will find fault with us. It makes me feel annoyed. Emperor Helian was annoyed. Naturally, he desired to replace Pavilion Master Lu with someone else. My Yang clan can send a few cultivators to assist little friend in seizing control of the Dongyuan Pavilion together, Yang Dongqing recommended. After we take over the Dongyuan Pavilion, little friend will have absolute control over the pavilion. You can access all parts of the pavilion to train and read ancient manuscripts anytime you want. I am sure this can help little friend's ability improve at a much faster rate. Yi Futian naturally understood when he heard this. Yang Dongqing most likely wanted more. He wanted to control the Dongyuan Pavilion from behind the scenes. He glanced at Yang Dongqing and then looked at Emperor Helian again and asked, There is a matter that I wish to ask seniors to enlighten me on. Back then, when Mr. South Mountain died, did anything occur behind the scenes? Of course. Emperor Helian coldly snorted and said, Back then, Mr. South Mountain was also an extraordinary man. He was also good friends with Lu Han. No one imagined that Lu Han would backstab him. He was afraid that Mr. South Mountain would try to meddle in the affairs of the Dongyuan Pavilion. Hence, Lu Han found an excuse to eliminate him. Has Senior investigated this matter? Yi Futian asked as he revealed a strange look. It does not even need to be investigated, Emperor Helian replied. Based on my intel, before Mr. South Mountain died, his cultivation was already not below that of Pavilion Master Lu Han. He was even more powerful than Lu Han by some margin. Why would he suddenly die and without any premonition? If it was as Lu Han claimed, why would Mr. South Mountain head right into his own death? The cultivators of South Mountain were also eradicated later on. This had clearly been premeditated. Emperor Helian coldly snorted. To attack a good friend, greed has blinded Lu Han. Yi Futian nodded his head and said, I will take up your offer, Senior. He agreed to become the new pavilion master of Dongyuan Pavilion. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.